Mrs. Lillian was no ordinary woman. She owned one of the largest companies in the city, built by her and her late husband from the ground up. After his death, she took over everything, making sure the business continued to grow. People often said that she was sharp, smart, and always 3 steps ahead of everyone in the business world. But what no one knew was that since her husband passed away, she had felt very lonely. The big house she lived in felt empty, and even with all her success, something was missing. At the company, people admired her, but she never allowed anyone to get close. She didn't have many friends, and no one knew much about her personal life. She kept her feelings hidden, even though she often thought about her husband and the promises they had made to each other. One person who had worked at the company for a long time but was almost invisible to everyone was Tom, the janitor. Tom had been at the company for years, but he was quiet and stayed out of the way. He always wore an old worn-out cap, and his clothes were usually dusty from cleaning all day. People often walked past him without even noticing he was there, but Tom didn't mind. He loved his simple job and never complained. He was always friendly and smiled when someone said hello. In his own quiet way, Tom watched everything that went on in the office. He saw how people hurried from meeting to meeting, talking about things he didn't understand. He liked that no one paid much attention to him, allowing him to quietly do his work without any fuss. One late afternoon, just as Tom was finishing up his work for the day, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Lillian, the powerful and mysterious owner of the company, walked up to him. He had never spoken to her directly before, and for a moment, he wondered if he had done something wrong. "Tom," she said softly, her voice calm but serious, "I'd like to ask you a favor." Tom blinked, confused. Why would Mrs. Lillian, of all people, want to talk to him? "Of course, ma'am," he said quickly, pulling off his cap out of respect. "What do you need?" Mrs. Lillian looked at him thoughtfully, as if she were trying to make a difficult decision. Her eyes, usually so sharp and focused, seemed softer now, as though she was about to share something important. Tom stood still, his heart beating a little faster. He didn't know what was coming, but it felt important. "There's a big business meeting tomorrow," she began slowly, "and I'd like you to attend it with me." Tom was completely stunned. His mouth dropped open, and he wasn't sure if he had heard her correctly. He quickly put his cap back on, scratching his head in confusion. "Me? But ma'am, I'm just the janitor," he said, shaking his head. "I don't know anything about business meetings. I clean the floors and empty the trash bins. Why would you need me?" Mrs. Lillian smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people gave when they were trying to be polite. It was more of a secret smile, like she knew something that no one else did. "That's exactly why I need you," she replied. "You've been here for years, and I've noticed how careful you are with things. You might not know this, but I trust you, Tom. I've seen the way you work, the way you carry yourself, and the way you listen. And most importantly, I know you're honest." Tom was still trying to wrap his head around what she was saying. Him, honest. Sure, he was honest, but that didn't mean he belonged in some big business meeting with powerful people. He imagined all the fancy people in suits talking about numbers and deals he didn't understand. He'd stick out like a sore thumb. "Ma'am, I really don't think I'm the right person for this." "I don't even own a suit," Tom said nervously. Mrs. Lillian's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Don't worry about that. I'm not asking you to talk about numbers or wear a fancy suit. I need someone there who can see things clearly, someone who won't be fooled by all the business talk. And I believe that person is you." Tom stared at her for a long moment, trying to figure out if she was serious. He had always thought of himself as just the janitor, the guy who cleaned up after everyone else. But here was Mrs. Lillian, the most powerful person in the company, telling him that she needed him, someone who had never done anything like this before. A part of him wanted to say no, to walk away and pretend this conversation had never happened. But another part of him, a smaller voice deep inside, told him that maybe, just maybe, this was something special. He had never been asked to do anything like this before. What if she was right? What if he could help her? Finally, after what felt like a long silence, Tom nodded slowly. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." Mrs. Lillian smiled again, this time with relief. "Thank you, Tom. I promise you, you won't regret it." As she turned and walked away, Tom stood there, still trying to process what had just happened. Tomorrow, he was going to walk into a high-stakes business meeting with one of the most powerful women in the city, and he had no idea what was going to happen. The next morning, Tom woke up feeling nervous. His mind was still spinning from Mrs. Lillian's request. He had spent years cleaning the office, quietly going about his work without anyone noticing, and now he was about to walk into a high-stakes business meeting with the owner of the entire company. It felt like a dream. No, more like a strange nightmare. He didn't own any fancy clothes, just his usual work uniform and an old button-down shirt he hadn't worn in years. Standing in front of the mirror, he sighed. "Well, I'll just have to do the best I can," he muttered to himself. With his worn-out cap firmly on his head, he headed out the door. When he arrived at the company's fancy office building, Tom felt out of place immediately. Everything sparkled. The floors, the walls, even the light fixtures seemed to shine like gold. He walked down the hallway to the big meeting room Mrs. Lillian had told him about. The people in suits hurrying by with briefcases and important papers stared at him as he passed. Tom could feel their eyes on him, whispering to one another. "What's a janitor doing here?" he imagined them saying. He kept his head down, feeling more and more unsure with each step. Finally, Tom reached the large wooden doors of the meeting room. His hands were sweaty, and he hesitated for a moment before pushing them open. As he stepped inside, the room went silent for a brief second. There were big windows with a view of the entire city, shiny polished tables, and expensive leather chairs. Everything screamed wealth and power. Tom swallowed hard. Sitting at the table was Mrs. Lillian, looking calm and composed as always, her sharp eyes watching everyone closely. Across from her was a man Tom had never seen before but had heard whispers about, Mr. Blackstone. He was tall, with slicked-back hair, a dark suit, and a confident, almost cocky, smirk on his face. Sitting beside him was his assistant, a cold, stern-looking woman who scribbled notes and occasionally whispered into his ear. Tom shuffled awkwardly behind Mrs. Lillian, unsure of where to stand or sit. Mr. Blackstone glanced at him for a brief second, then looked away, not even acknowledging him with a nod. To Mr. Blackstone, Tom was invisible, just a janitor in the wrong place. But Tom noticed Mrs. Lillian glance at him and give him a small, reassuring smile. The meeting began, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Blackstone wasted no time diving straight into the business talk. He spoke with big, clever words that made Tom's head spin. Revenue projections, market shares, mergers, and acquisitions were tossed around like candy at a parade. Tom had no idea what most of it meant, but he listened carefully. Something about the way Mr. Blackstone was talking didn't feel right. Mrs. Lillian remained calm, asking questions but never showing any emotion. Tom could see that she wasn't fooled by Mr. Blackstone's smooth talking. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman. She was sharp and always thinking ahead. But even so, Mr. Blackstone kept pushing, using more complicated terms and trying to make Mrs. Lillian look like she didn't understand what was happening. Tom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building up inside him. He wasn't a businessman, but he knew when something didn't feel right. As Mr. Blackstone continued, Tom's eyes wandered around the table, taking in every little detail. That's when he noticed it. Just under the edge of Mr. Blackstone's sleek black briefcase, a piece of paper was peeking out. It wasn't part of the stack of papers being discussed. It was hidden. Tom's heart began to race. The document was barely visible, but there was something about the way it was placed, almost as if Mr. Blackstone didn't want anyone to see it. What could it be? Tom's mind raced. Could it be important, or was he just imagining things? As the meeting dragged on, Tom found it harder and harder to stay quiet. His instincts were telling him that the hidden paper was important, but he wasn't sure if he should say anything. What if he was wrong? What if it was just some unimportant document, and he made a fool of himself in front of everyone? He could feel the sweat on his palms, and his heart thumped louder with every passing second. Meanwhile, Mr. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, looking more confident than ever. He was pushing Mrs. Lillian to sign a deal, one that he promised would benefit both sides greatly. But Tom could see through the flashy words. This deal wasn't meant to help Mrs. Lillian. Mr. Blackstone had a sly grin on his face, and his assistant nodded along, both of them acting as if they had already won. Suddenly, Tom's eyes shot back to the hidden paper. His pulse quickened, and before he could stop himself, he took a deep breath and spoke up. Excuse me, Tom said, his voice shaky and uncertain. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. Mr. Blackstone's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly annoyed that the janitor had interrupted. Mrs. Lillian, however, looked at Tom with calm curiosity. There's something there under the briefcase, Tom pointed nervously. I think there's a paper under there that you might want to see. For a moment, no one moved. The room was completely silent, and Tom's heart felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. Mr. Blackstone's smirk vanished, replaced by a tense, cold stare. He glanced down at the briefcase, and his hand quickly shifted to cover the paper. But it was too late. Mrs. Lillian's sharp eyes had already locked onto the hidden document. Move the briefcase, Blackstone, she said calmly, her voice full of authority. Mr. Blackstone hesitated but slowly slid the briefcase to the side, revealing the document underneath. Mrs. Lillian reached out and picked it up, her eyes scanning the page quickly. The room was thick with tension as she read the document. Tom's breath caught in his throat as Mrs. Lillian's expression changed. Her eyes widened ever so slightly, and for a brief moment, Tom thought he saw something like anger flicker across her face. Mr. Blackstone shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Lillian looked up, meeting Mr. Blackstone's eyes. You were trying to cheat me, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Tom's heart pounded as the realization hit him. He had just uncovered something big, something that Mr. Blackstone had tried to hide, and now everything was about to change. The room seemed to freeze in time. No one dared to speak as Mrs. Lillian's eyes moved back and forth over the words written on the paper. The quiet tension in the room felt like it was about to explode. Tom shifted nervously, unsure of what was going to happen next. His mind raced with doubt. Maybe he had made a mistake. Maybe this paper wasn't as important as he thought. He could feel Mr. Blackstone's icy stare burning into him, but he didn't look up. What if this decision to speak up had made things worse? Mr. Blackstone, who had been calm and confident just moments ago, was now visibly uncomfortable. His assistant nervously shuffled her papers, trying to avoid eye contact with everyone in the room. Mr. Blackstone cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, trying to regain control of the situation. Mrs. Lillian, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, he said smoothly, though there was a slight tremor in his voice. That document is probably just an old file or a draft. Nothing important. We don't need to get distracted by small details. Let's continue with the deal. But Mrs. Lillian didn't respond right away. She remained quiet, her eyes still scanning the document. Tom could see that something had changed in her expression. There was a flicker of anger, but also a steely determination. Tom swallowed hard. Had he done the right thing, or had he made a terrible mistake? Just as the silence became unbearable, Mrs. Lillian gently set the paper down on the table. She looked up, her gaze steady and calm, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. Mr. Blackstone, she said quietly, her voice firm. This is not a misunderstanding. The room seemed to grow even colder as her words hung in the air. Tom held his breath. This document, Mrs. Lillian continued, is not an old file or a draft. It's a hidden agreement you intended to slip past me, one that would have handed over control of my company's most valuable assets to you. Tom's heart raced as he heard the words. So he had been right. The paper under the briefcase was crucial, and it had saved Mrs. Lillian from a disastrous deal. Mr. Blackstone's face turned pale. He fumbled with the papers in front of him, trying to gather his thoughts. His assistant looked down at her notepad, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The smooth, confident businessman who had entered the room minutes ago was now stumbling over his words. Mrs. Lillian shook her head. You did exactly what was needed, and for that, I am forever grateful. There was a long, quiet pause as Tom absorbed everything she had told him. He thought back to all the times Mr. Lillian had stopped to chat with him, how he had always been kind and friendly, even when Tom was just mopping floors. Those moments had meant something. They had shaped the trust Mrs. Lillian now had in him. Finally, Tom managed to speak again. Your husband. He was a good man, he said softly. I didn't know him well, but I could tell he always treated me with respect. I never thought I'd be helping him even after he was gone. Mrs. Lillian smiled, her eyes glistening with unspoken tears. "He believed in you, Tom, and today, you showed me why." Tom smiled through his own tears, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of pride and belonging. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, someone who had been trusted and respected. And for the first time in his life, Tom truly believed in himself. As Mrs. Lillian rose from her seat and extended her hand, Tom stood up and shook it firmly, knowing that this moment had changed everything. They were no longer just the businesswoman and the janitor. They were a team. As Tom stood there, his hand firmly grasping Mrs. Lillian's, he felt a surge of confidence wash over him. He could hardly believe what had just happened. He had gone from being the quiet observer, the janitor on the sidelines, to playing a crucial role in exposing a deceitful plot. For the first time, he felt seen and valued. Mrs. Lillian released his hand, giving him a warm, appreciative smile. "Tom," she said, her voice steady, "you saved my company today. Without you, I might have signed away something irreplaceable. You have my deepest gratitude." Mr. Blackstone, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, finally found his voice. "Now, hold on," he stammered, trying to compose himself. "This isn't over, Mrs. Lillian. Mrs. Lillian raised a hand, cutting him off. "Oh, I believe it is, Mr. Blackstone. Not only have you shown yourself to be dishonest, but you've also underestimated the people who work here. Tom has proven that integrity matters, and I intend to reward that." She turned to her assistant and said, "Please see to it that Mr. Blackstone is escorted out. I don't think we need his services any longer." Mr. Blackstone's face turned an even deeper shade of red as security was called to escort him out. As he walked past Tom, he shot him a venomous look, but Tom met his gaze with a newfound strength. For the first time, Tom felt that he was standing up not just for himself, but for what was right. When Mr. Blackstone had finally left, Mrs. Lillian turned back to Tom. "I'd like to offer you a new position," she said, her eyes sparkling. "One that will allow you to use that keen eye and good sense you showed today. How would you feel about a role in our risk management department?" Tom's eyes widened. "Me? In risk management?" he stammered, feeling a mix of excitement and disbelief. "Yes," Mrs. Lillian replied with a grin. "After all, you clearly have a talent for spotting trouble before it happens. I think you'd be perfect for the role. And besides, it's about time you stepped out of the janitorial closet and into an office where you belong." Tom laughed, a genuine heartfelt laugh that filled the room. "I'd be honored," he said, nodding eagerly. "I never thought I'd have an opportunity like this." Mrs. Lillian patted him on the shoulder. "Believe in yourself, Tom. You've earned it. Now, let's get you introduced to the team." As they walked through the halls of the building, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had found his place and discovered a purpose he had never thought possible. The future looked brighter than ever, and Tom was ready to embrace every challenge that came his way. In the days that followed, Tom settled into his new role, learning quickly and proving his worth time and again. Mrs. Lillian's company thrived under their shared vigilance, and Tom became a trusted member of her inner circle. He knew he still had much to learn, but with Mrs. Lillian's mentorship and his newfound confidence, he was ready to take on whatever came next. And so, the janitor who had once walked the hallways with his head down was now a respected part of the company's future. A testament to the power of integrity, courage, and the belief that sometimes, even the quietest voice can change everything.